solving general humanoid robots would be a monumentally large and valuable market. You can only build so many robotaxis before you saturate. It's a lot of cars, but it's not that many cars. You could probably satisfy the whole Earth with 100 million-ish vehicles. You don't even need a robotaxi anymore if a humanoid robot can just step behind the wheel and drive the car. The difficulty of the humanoid robot problem is between 10,000 times and 1,000,000 times more than the difficulty of doing robotaxi.
I think that's indicative of the march of nines that's necessary for these AI projects that we just don't understand how big the lift is to get from where we are to where we're going.
This is really hard. And I think that I think Elon probably understands that it's really hard and is going to try to punch through the wall. But I think that the person on the sidelines needs to appreciate that there's going to need to be a huge effort to make this stuff work in a generalizable way. The Adam Jonases of the world who are wildly bullish on it now will be turning around and being like, Tesla is wasting resources on this thing. This is crazy. It's never going to happen. That is all to come. It is almost inevitable that we will run into that. And I do think it's achievable, but don't underestimate kind of the pain and agony that the Tesla shareholders will experience trying to get there when it is costing potentially hundreds of billions of dollars that could otherwise be lining your pockets.
Well, today I have Brett Winton with me. He is the director of research at ARK Invest, who famously has an incredible valuation model and bull case around Tesla's valuation that is primarily focused on the rollout of robotaxis. And in the Tesla community, a lot of people like to give ARK flack because they say, hey, where is Optimus? And so today we're going to be diving into the reasons why so many people in the Tesla community may be a little bit delusional about the complexity of the Optimus problem and how hard it's going to be to do that. And then because of how hard, what the timelines that we should maybe be a little bit more realistically setting our expectations for Optimus. And so, yeah, Brett, I just want to ask you, what makes Optimus such a hard problem? And when is ARK thinking that it's reasonable to start expecting some sort of revenue out of Optimus for Tesla?
Well, one, I do agree that solving general humanoid robots would be a monumentally large and valuable market. So I think that at a high level, there's a reason to point to that as hey, this is the next frontier we need to get to. The humanoid form factor is useful because it could plug in a general purpose way into all of the existing tooling and infrastructure that we have out there. It's kind of you don't even need a robotaxi anymore if a humanoid robot can just step behind the wheel and drive the car, right? And so, suddenly you get all the benefits of a robotaxi across not just the Teslas that have been sold into market, but every vehicle in the world. It's such a monumentally difficult problem. And I think that we're still in a state where we haven't been confronted with actually what these robots are capable of in the real world because they're not being commercially sold in. And so we don't know how incapable they actually are and how much effort and attention will have to go into making them capable. And so even if Google has been going about this whole robotaxi thing for, more than a decade. As in, I did my first unit economics case on a robotaxi, I think in 2011, and was hey, they could do this at 50 cents a mile. This would be amazing. And it's because they were demonstrating their little panda car or koala car driving around. And as it turns out, getting those nines of accuracy, not just in terms of avoiding accident and injury, but just providing a decent riding experience is an incredible, long, hard slog of improvements, of basically order of magnitude improvements over time. And it's clear that that's accelerating when you go AI first. And Tesla's advances, even over the past 2 years, is really incredible. And on a first order basis, I think you can say with some certainty that the difficulty of the humanoid robot problem is between 10,000 times and 1,000,000 times more than the difficulty of doing robotaxi. So starting from where we are at robotaxi, imagine something 100,000 times harder. And currently, we're still working on the modeling here, but 200,000 times harder is, I think, what our mid case is going to end up being. And you say, oh my gosh, it's the equivalent of kind of, instead of being 1 in every 700,000 miles for an accident, which they need to tip across to hit the commercialization threshold, in robotaxi, you have to be, 1 in, 10 to the, whatever that is, 10 to the 12th instead of 10 to the 6th in terms of accuracy. So you have to do another 6 orders of magnitude beyond that to cross a equivalent commercialization threshold in humanoid robots. And so Elon doesn't he kind of called it in this most recent earnings call where he's like, you don't just get to tip over the log and hey, you're done. This is going to be a huge monumental effort, not just on the hardware manufacturing scaling, which he focused on, but also in providing the software capability that these will need to be generally useful.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Andrei Karpathy podcast with Dwarkesh that, he talked about the fact that he had his first Waymo ride, I think it was in 2013 or 2014, something to that effect. It's like, oh, wow, like self-driving is almost solved. And then he went to work at Tesla and all of that was 11 to 12 years ago. And now we're finally like on the cusp of getting this thing. And that's, I think that's indicative of the, like you said, the March of Nines that's necessary for these AI projects that we just don't understand how big the lift is to get from where we are to where we're going. And especially how that relates to the complexity of the environment that you're trying to operate in. It's like driving is a very constrained environment compared to all of the environments that Optimus is going to be placed in. Now, I'm sure there are some environments that you can place Optimus inside of that are as constrained or more constrained than you have for driving. But for those constrained environments, can you acquire sufficient data? It's like you can have the constrained environment that's easy to operate inside of, but then do you get what you need to actually train a great a great Optimus AI model to operate inside of that? And so I think that that trade-off is going to be something that's very difficult.
Yeah, and that's only like if you peel back the onion one layer as to how we get to the difference in complexity. You can kind of first principles it in you mentioned the environmental variability, which is absolutely a factor. And so like the way we think about that is like, how many, like environmental variability is really disaggregates into 3 factors. It's what is like, how many objects do you simultaneously need to pay attention to around you? And maybe like with robotaxi versus humanoid robots, that could be pretty similar depending on how you think about kind of like, a robotaxi is having to take it like into account a lot of cars and pedestrians and stuff. But then it's like, how many different object types do you have to know, like the semantics of objects? Whereas a robotaxi can, depending on the generalizability, it's like there's vehicles and pedestrians and I don't know, chickens or something, or animals, or and maybe you're going one layer deeper where it's like, well, I'm treating vehicles different, like cars different from trucks, or cars different from emergency vehicles, certainly. But certainly or humanoid robots have a much, much broader diversity, probably an order of magnitude more at least, of kind of object types they need to be able to recognize as dynamic objects in the environment. And then there is the relative structuredness of the environment. And the road system is designed to really make it easy to drive. Like the road system is designed for vehicles to navigate from place to place successfully and has been heavily synthetically manipulated to make that happen. The lines in the middle of the road, and this is true in developed markets, and particularly not as true in developing markets, which is why driving in India is so challenging relative to driving in the US. And that's one category of kind of complexity difference that humanoid robots face versus robotaxis. Think about like even the control system of a robotaxi. You basically have steering wheel, brake, and accelerator. And that's what Ashok talks about in terms of like the challenges. You take in this huge context. For him, it's 2 billion tokens. You output it into basically 2 control functions, which is basically acceleration, and steering angle, right? With humanoid robots, you're outputting it into 20 to 40 different control functions, across all of your different actuated joints, depending on how much kind of like consolidation you can do of each of those. And then as you're changing those actuations, you're also changing your sensor inputs dynamically at the same time. If you bend down to pick something up, like your entire like frame of reference is shifting at the same time. And so that's another big bucket, combined with how frequently you have to adjust kind of like your operations with, if you're trying to catch a ball, like you actually need to have much higher frequency kind of like changing of kind of the actuators. And that's one of the advances on the mechanical side that they've crossed is, hey, we have much more dynamic control of the actuators, but you have to have the software to actually do that. So that's the other big category. So you have environmental variability. You have basically call it action bandwidth. And then you have the interaction set with a robotaxi. You're just rubber on road. Like the thing that you're physically interacting with, unless you get in an accident, which you don't want to do, is not changing. There's like the parametric change of maybe the road is slicker and stuff like that. But it's basically like a very simple set of interactions you have to account for. Whereas a humanoid robot, you have to have a different level of complexity based upon the number of physical interactions it needs to learn. So think about like heel strikes versus toe strikes when you're walking. Think about all the different surfaces you might be walking on. Think about lifting up a tool and knowing the physics of that tool and how you need to lift it to, and the variety of tools that you have to lift. So that's another huge bucket of difference. And then the fourth major complexity increase for humanoid robots is like the number of tasks that you have to learn is, I don't know, maybe 1,000 times more than the number of tasks you need to know for robotaxi. The task is get from point A to point B. Whereas kind of there's an entire overlay of basically like logic system and understanding of how to do tasks that also compounds into the complexity of the problem. And so you can generalize across some tasks, like learning how to screw in a screwdriver. It's probably similar to, I don't know, learning how to turn a doorknob. And, so it's not like that leads to another 1,000x increase in complexity. The way we do the math is it's more like another order of magnitude. But all of those compound together to create an overall system that we think, if held to the same performance standard, would probably be more like 10 million times more complicated. But your humanoid robots are not going at 60 miles per hour and they don't weigh 2 tons. So you are much more safety tolerant or error tolerant with a humanoid robot. Like maybe you're not going to trust it to like hold your newborn baby, but if it bangs its shin, that's okay. And so then we like walk back the complexity by 2 orders of magnitude, because basically on the kinetic energy difference of the system, we think you'll be 100 times more error tolerant. So then that nets out to like all of the math underlying that gives you an expectation for 100,000x more complex a problem space that you're operating in. And so I'm sorry, this is really hard. And I think that I think Elon probably understands that it's really hard and is going to try to punch through the wall. But I think that the person on the sidelines needs to appreciate that there's going to need to be a huge effort to make this stuff work in a generalizable way.
Yeah, and like we need to see, there's a lot of different things that we need to see in between here and there. Like there's so many milestones. Yeah, even thinking about that gap between, the Waymo prototype in 2013 and like robotaxi unsupervised Waymos today in 2025, like we don't even have the full Waymo in 2013 prototype of a working humanoid Optimus. Like, I'm sorry, dancing doesn't count.
Right.
We're not hiring them for ballet.
Yes, the dancing, it's kind of like the dancing demos and the acrobatic demos are taking that big complexity stack that I illustrated, and then they are actually stripping and reducing it like just to basically the action bandwidth side. As in, if you like put that dancing robot on slightly uneven terrain, what happens is it falls over and starts like rattling around on the ground, right? It's like basically they are massively narrowing the complexity on other parts of the stack in order to demonstrate that it's possible with software to do the specific, very narrow task. And I think that the difference between the reason the analogy isn't totally true of Waymo 2013-ish to humanoids today is Waymo at the time was working on, and still I think is working on, a much more fragile software stack that they couldn't kind of like throw compute at in order to improve. They had to throw good human ingenuity to figure out different like algorithms and simplifications in order to improve it. And so there is if I take our expectations for robotaxi cash flow and I begin to throw it into AI compute, then I think that humanoid robots could get solved from the software side in like 2029, 2030, conditional on robotaxi producing enough cash flow that you are putting around $200 billion into the AI compute required to support kind of the humanoid robot effort. So it's extraordinarily expensive, and it would be great money spent. But that's like the scale of the problem, of the challenge that confronts Tesla. And it's part of the reason why Elon's like, hey, we need to look at if we can do distributed training here, because I'd rather not spend all of that out of my own pocket. I'd rather have it, on these vehicles that are already sold in and operating on the road. Maybe I can use some of the training compute in order to throw at the humanoid robot problem, because it really is so vast and complex a problem.
Yeah, and you can, since the computers that are going to be in the cars are going to be relatively similar to the computers that eventually go into the Optimus robots that can do all of these things, you can use the ones that are in the cars to do RL inside of a synthetic training environment, that like a world simulator just for Optimus that is very similar to the world simulator that Ashok has just shown off for full self-driving. But like, obviously, as you mentioned, much, much, much more complex, much, much richer. Like, just think about think about
the world simulator. Like, like Tesla has this amazing world simulator of cars on roads. Now imagine like, okay, do that, but for like walking around in your house, you have to have like in my house, you have to have like a 1-year-old trying to toddle by and like falling over in front of you. You have to have a dog that comes over and barks at you because it thinks you're, an alien from outer space. You have to have like the complexity of doing that world simulation is so much more than what Tesla can currently do closed loop, because people do all kinds of crazy things in cars. And it is a pretty tightly constrained environment in terms of like what can practically happen,
And think about how like data rich Tesla is to build that world sim for the driving environment, just to go back to that point. And like, how do you gather the data resource necessary to create the world sim for Optimus, where you have, hundreds of hours worth of Brett's house, and then, every single person's house, every intersection, all the different things, to where you can actually have a world simulator that is a proper encapsulation of the long tail of crazy things that happen everywhere all the time.
Right. But that's, I could be holding this to too high a bar, as in, if you think about, one, FSD has been, even though Robotaxi isn't commercialized yet, FSD, for me, the driver is very useful, right? And it's not doing the full task. The full task is I can totally not pay attention, and it can go from place to place. And as it happens within the driving context, that's a big tipping point in terms of like commercialization potential, as in it's evident that it's like not a hyper commercializable feature relative to its utility until you cross that tipping point. And so in the translation of technical performance thresholds to markets is kind of its own black magic. And you can imagine even a humanoid robot that is not general purpose capable, it can't do dishes, fold laundry, work the laundry machine, like pick up leaves off the lawn, walk the dog, and take care of the kid, but instead can just take out the trash and it can just take out the trash. And then over time, also, it can pick up individual leaves off the lawn, so you don't have to have a lawn blower. And then over time, it can begin watering the plants. Like, you could have more analog monetization of this as opposed to robotaxi, which is really almost a binary in terms of the monetization potential. So it's like, what do you pay for some, a thing that can generally just like be your semi-incompetent handyman that wanders around the house and can only do a few things? Some people might pay for that, at least for the novelty value. And then over time, it gets more capable. And so there's like less of a kind of like monetization is very low and then it takes off, and more of an analog monetization as it takes on those tasks. And so then that could be how, Optimus is able to monetize in a more continuous fashion rather than discontinuously. But we will see.
Yeah, I think, Scott Walter's point on this would just be that there's probably going to be quite a few tasks. It's like, if you think of all the tasks that are going to be involved in Cybercab assembly, like maybe there's 1% of those tasks that you can start doing with Optimus. And then, as you improve the functionality and capability of Optimus over time, it grows to a larger and larger percentage. And you can use that as both the, R&D testing ground and the point where you're getting some form of return on the money that you're investing into these individual robots from a unit economic standpoint, to be like, okay, it cost us, if we're, excluding all the R&D, this robot was $100,000, and we at least got it to do, $20,000 worth of useful work before it broke down and we had to fix it.
And I think of it on the also like on the mobile servicing side. I wonder if that's if you think about like the set of tasks that the mobile servicing techs are able to do, and they show up, and oftentimes it's kind of just like physically looking at your vehicle, or hearing a thing and being like, oh, you have to go in, kind of like being kind of the front end of service in some way, or for some service functions, could be an interesting deployment where it's dealing with basically like one object type, the vehicle. They have all the data in the world on like all the service functions that happen on that vehicle. If they can begin to use it in the service center first, then it can become like, they can basically more capital efficiently expand mobile servicing. It could be an interesting angle. Or riding along in the Cybercab as the actual box delivery onto the doorstep. Like, I think that you could imagine on internal demand, they could find like little niches where it could plug in that gets them additional data and allows them to at least capital efficiently use the robots they've produced, in the ultimate aim of providing something that's economical enough that people will buy it into their households or buy it into their small manufacturing line to like scale up a function they wouldn't otherwise be able to efficiently.
Yeah. So we've talked about the software complexity. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I'm just curious to get your reaction to, is one of the things that Elon keeps saying is that, man, hands are hard. And I think based on the community's expectations of how fast Optimus is going to monetize, they don't grok what Elon means when he says hands are hard. And so, when you think about the hardware complexity, not even getting into the software complexity of hands, and the number of actuators. So if you want to have a 22 degree of freedom hand, that means you need 20 some odd actuators in the forearm. Maybe you can do some creative combinations, maybe you can't. But if this is going to be an economically viable product, you have to make all of those actuators much, much smaller than exist today. They need to be as efficient as the most efficient actuators are today. Then they need to have very low heat dissipation, or you have to actively cool them, one of the two, because you've got so many of these little tiny actuators in such a compact area, even in the forearm. Then they have to be extremely, extremely reliable. And the way that we solve reliability like that today is you just make the thing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times bigger so that you're operating well within the, reliable, or the like the maximum envelope that performance envelope that actuator could operate in. But you can't do that because you need every last ounce of maximum capacity that these things have. And then you combine that with all of the complexity of all the linkage that is involved in moving fingers from actuators that are in the forearm. And then you say all of that needs to be able to run for hundreds of hours, thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours without breaking down, in order for the robot that's using those hands to do useful work to actually make money, and for your maintenance, and both in cost and in uptime, not to completely tank the economics of your robot. So what's your response to thinking about that challenge?
I agree. I think it's like there's in some ways, at least the software side, you can say with some assurance, like you can argue about kind of like even the order of magnitude, but you can say with some assurance, I can dump like raw compute at this problem, assuming I am imbued with sufficient amounts of data, which I think it's a pretty safe assumption that they'll be able to get, but it's all intertied to the ability to deliver the hardware performance. And there, kind of like the complexity also explodes relative to a vehicle. And there's much less of a certainty that you can just throw resources at it in order to like move yourself forward. I think that there's it'll take smart engineering product design to like think about where you're going to take the simplification steps and what you're going to optimize to. What is the grip strength that you need? What is the kind of like, how closely do you need to mimic kind of actual full human hand to get to the 80% of tasks that you think are actually achievable with this thing? I thought it was really, Elon mentioned surgery on the call. I'm like, God, surgery is going to be the last thing that we will get to, because like, surgeons have notoriously the smoothest, best kind of like fine motor control. They've done so much practice at so high stakes. Your error tolerance is so low. It just seems like why would you would put all of that kind of mechanical precision into a robot purpose built to do surgery rather than having like Optimus bundle in and be like, I'm going to do field surgery here. Like, maybe Optimus will be useful for like a field amputation in the event of an emergency, but probably not the open heart surgery that we all think of. I just think it is, yes, there's a whole different, long, incredibly complex and challenging road on the mechanical and manufacturing side. And my understanding of the humanoid robots in field today is they do have a pretty high breakdown rate on the current set of actuators and sensors. Then they have little paddle hands for the most part. So I think it's, the hands themselves are probably a challenge, as difficult, at least probably more than the full body stuff that we see demoed today that really wows people, being able to do acrobatics and dance and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that is the easy trap to fall into. Is you see, it's like, wow, they obviously are so good at all of this, body manipulation and control. So it must just like, the fact that they've accomplished this must translate very easily to these other things that, wait a second, why have I never seen, a unit tree demo of solving a Rubik's Cube or something to that effect? And it's because that is not something that they're capable of doing, or anywhere even close to capable of doing. And certainly not with a hand that they can make for $1,000.
Right. And ultimately that's what there's like, certainly on the mechanical side, there is a hefty intersection with the economics here, where it's like you have to design to some level of economic viability, such that you can sell into some set of partner customers. I think the reason these companies are starting with kind of like the selling into manufacturing is in part like if you were to go into a household, I think you need to hit like a car type price point or less, probably like half that, 20,000 or 25. And we're not close to that yet. But ultimately, I would think that disruption theory would suggest that it's actually kind of like that householder, that the small manufacturer that has like 6 people working together to build stuff, where if one guy's sick, then you're kind of a man down and you're like constrained, where you have a robot that can kind of pitch in where these will sell in. So it actually doesn't make that much sense to say, hey, this robot is going to compete with all of the wildly automated functions that are in an automotive factory already, where everything that is easily automatable has already been done. Everything that's not is because it requires like pretty specific human kind of dexterity and kind of bending around. And I think it'll actually be net harder to plug a robot into those slots. At least, and so then there's like stuff at the margin, like moving stuff around that they're trying to crack. But my suspicion is that's not actually that useful, particularly if it's breaking down all the time. So I think there's not a guarantee that this is a solvable economic problem, this cycle, is what it comes down to. I think it will take insane hard effort. And that's why, if he alluded to it, like the shareholder package or the compensation package for Elon, or basically they give him more control of the company package. I think it's important because the bias of Tesla, the corporate entity, will be to not do this thing. Because like, why spend $200 billion and an insane amount of sweat equity and all of this engineering time to solve this extraordinarily challenging problem, when you could just collect the rent off your Robotaxi franchise, sit back, do share buybacks and, pay out dividends. And it's like just become average from your current position would be, I think, an amazing financial outcome for Tesla, but actually a great squandering of the potential of the corporate entity. And that's why having Elon maximally pushed into like driving the ship forward is important, because institutions by their nature, bureaucracies by their nature, sand off the interesting edges and create the smooth average stones. And I think the company has the chance to still be extraordinarily spiky and kind of pierce kind of the frontier of what's possible for humans. And so it would be great for the world for him to be super engaged.
Do you remember what was the number? I was just looking it up, of robots that Elon has to deliver for the compensation package. Was it 1 million Optimus robots?
I don't know offhand.
Vaguely. Yeah.
That's a good question.
I think when I first saw the number, I was like, oh, that's not actually that many. And now I'm definitely second guessing that, like 1 million Optimus robots is going to be quite like whenever you reach 1 million, you're almost guaranteed to have reached escape velocity.
Well, if you've solved the software side, but like presumably you're producing 1 million because you can find 1 million uses
Customers,
for them. Yeah. And I mean, I think it is like he approaches it from like the total mass in this thing is less than the total mass in the cars, so then they should be less expensive to produce. But mass crosses with like complexity. And I think that there's like you say, like the mechanical actuation side is going to be super thorny to scale. My view is robotaxi execution is achievable without Elon. And in fact, it would be an incredible squandering if Tesla did not, given their current set of positions. Maybe timeline drags a little bit, but we're almost across the finish line here, folks. Like you can hear it. But I think without him really pushing, I don't think humanoid robots is something that will happen this business cycle. I really think it requires both him to push, because as he pushes, the talent, he burns up talent. And so then they kind of like peel off into the other entities who then try to follow along. I mean, I think there's like a future equilibrium where we're driving forward humanoid robots, and it's happening, and maybe Tesla's doing it, and there's Chinese companies doing it, and kind of this is a kind of like set of technological artifacts that we'll all have access to in some way, and we'll enjoy the benefits of. And there's another forward universe where, people say, God, figure AI at this valuation, and this was crazy. Like, none of this was actually possible. And it's not that it wasn't possible. It's not. It's that, like, were there enough sharp, pointy, like, entities that were determined enough to push through? Because I think the challenge is, like, monumentally difficult. And that's I think he was alluding to it, but I think that's kind of like what you're alluding to as well, is like, do not underestimate how hard this will be, how there will be like the equivalent of the Model 3 scaling. It won't put the company at risk, but it'll make people question, gosh, we are spending so much money on this thing. Is it ever going to cross a threshold where it's going to begin to return capital? And the Adam Jonases of the world, who are wildly bullish on it now, will be turning around and being like, Tesla is wasting resources on this thing. This is crazy. They should just be doing, this is, it's never going to happen. That is all to come. Like, it is almost inevitable that we will run into this cycle. And I do think it's achievable, but don't underestimate kind of the pain and agony that the Tesla shareholders will experience trying to get there when it is costing potentially hundreds of billions of dollars, that could otherwise be lining your pockets, all to reinvest in kind of a franchise that then becomes, again, an order of magnitude more valuable.
Yeah, it almost, it makes me think of the Gartner hype cycle chart. And I think whenever, whatever prototype it is that we can assign it to, I don't know, maybe the peak is the V3 prototype whenever they release that. If it even comes in Q1, I'm skeptical, maybe later next year. That's where it's like everyone is max excited about Optimus and what it's going to be able to do and how fast it's going to be able to do all those things. And then we'll get to go through the big long slog of, having reality smack people in the face. But eventually it'll be even bigger than, the wildest initial expectations eventually. Yeah. And it's like Jensen had to do this with CUDA and the slog that you're talking about, where shareholders hated it, management hated it. The board, took quite a bit of cajoling, and even the I can't remember what his name is, but that activist outside investor took a position, and I'm sure toyed with the idea of forcing Jensen to stop investing all this money in CUDA, but was able to at least get him to do a share buyback and, did a quick double on his money and got out. But that's the type of attention that gets attracted to this. And one of the reasons why Elon needs to have the control and the incentive structure that you outlined in order to reach for these crazy things. I do think like the control is really important for him, because I think he would be motivated to do it anyways. Like, I think Optimus is 100% required on the pathway to settling, a self-sustaining civilization on Mars.
Yes.
And so I think he has sufficient intrinsic motivation to accomplish this. The question is, does he do that inside of Tesla, or does he say, nope, never mind, I'm going to do this over here in XAI because it's a private company and I don't have to deal with all of you crazy shareholders.
Right. Or yes. I mean, I think in some ways you're absolutely right, as in kind of like you need the robots for Mars, and all of the technologies that he's building are useful on Mars. The tunnels, the robots, the solar panels, I guess we don't have a nuclear exposure yet, but he would argue solar's enough. Certainly the rockets and everything at SpaceX and XAI stuff. Neuralink maybe less so. But I think that I think Tesla shareholders should think of this as, yes, competing for a wedge of Elon's attention and motivation in some ways. And it's kind of like, where do you want him to throw in kind of his maximum push? And you unlock so much option value. Like on the long kind of business cycle length time horizon, businesses basically resolve to return on invested capital. Like that's how you create value, is you have high return on invested capital. And I think that the capital that will be thrown into Optimus will be high return if he's pushing. If you can also have technologies that forever, like they generate zero return, even though you throw money into them over time. Like, and that's another potential outcome. Like in some ways, that's the outcome that Wall Street would probably optimize to, is like, oh yes, we're not doing Optimus. There's just like this sits in the other bets category that we don't actually pay attention to, and it's just like soaks up capital and kind of like, it's nobody's like really driven to push anything over the finish line, and they kind of like haphazardly get there. I think that's a different way this could end up without the maximal push. I think it really is required here because it's so hard a problem. It's really so dramatically hard.
And then from an investor standpoint, how do you think about, if we live in a hypothetical world where Tesla is generating ridiculous amounts of free cash flow from robotaxis, and then they're turning around and they're plowing a large portion of that free cash flow into compute and R&D, and probably, a lot of compute is the biggest bucket in there, I would assume. Do you hold NVIDIA and Tesla so that you can double dip from the flywheel? Or and how does the market respond to the valuation of Tesla if they're spending all that money on this Optimus thing?
Well, yeah, I think that there's a, if you think about how we value the company, as we say, what would, the operating earnings, and the market will pay a multiple for operating earnings consistent with the free cash flow you could generate off it if they weren't reinvesting. And so, like, I think a rational market would look at that and be like, well, they can always pull the plug on this program, and then I would get this much net present value of cash flow on a forward basis. And you're trusting management that's reinvesting to be reinvesting in a smart way. Practically, and it's like, even if you're trading it off a multiple of earnings, the investment in CAPEX wouldn't count against earnings. It would be, on the balance sheet side. So you could be tolerant of that. If you're trading multiple of free cash flow, then you say, hey, they have to do this in order to keep up. But I think that people would be able to distinguish it. So net, it doesn't, if there's like, I do think there's like there's competition for capital allocation, where once robotaxi's going, and the way our model works is they take like a big bucket of their cash and they say, we're investing this in car factories as fast as we can, right? To scale production, because, we're going to dominate the world in robotaxi. And the reality of the model is that the constraint is not capital. It's really, there's like a certain maximum scaling rate that we think they can go on that's governed by management bandwidth, just ability you can't copy and replace the factories. You have to negotiate the deal for where the factory goes. There's just other factors that get in the way that aren't capital. And so kind of like you end up with this excess of cash that, as we model it, just builds on the balance sheet. And then at the end of the valuation, we say, well, this is what I pay for the operating business, and then this is what I pay for the balance sheet that's sitting there. And practically, instead of it just sitting on the balance sheet, they're probably reinvesting more into AI compute than we currently have modeled, because that's what you'd need, and scaling actual manufacturing production of the robots. So by excluding Optimus from the model, as we currently do, you ignore the fact that it's going to soak up a bunch of the excess cash that we have building up on the balance sheet. And like over, again, a business cycle forward from 2030, or even from like 2028, that becomes a really meaningful ROIC function. Like, you can only build so many robotaxis before you saturate a market. Then it's like, it's a lot of cars, but it's not that many cars. There's 2 billion cars on Earth. You don't need, depending on your assumptions, you could probably satisfy the whole Earth with 100 million-ish vehicles, robotaxis, right? And so kind of like, you don't need to get up to, if each one lasts 5 years, like you can dominate the world at a 20 million production volume, right? It's not exactly how the math works, but that's just roughing it out. So you don't need to double production like more than a few times before you're like, okay, I'm getting close to where I'm saturating here. So then you can't, even if you're not governed kind of on your ability to deploy the capital, at some point you're governed by your saturation of your underlying market. You need another spot to stick that capital. I'd prefer it not being dividended out. I'd prefer it being invested in something that's going to improve the world. And, Optimus seems like a good sink for that capital that will absorb a lot of it to create, more sustainable abundance.
Exactly. Yep. And I think, it'll be interesting to see where they go with the compute on this. Elon's talked extensively about how, AI 5 is going to be 40 times better, performance wise than the AI 4 computers, which I think even in that is like hinting towards, hey, we're going to need a lot more processing power in these Optimus robots than we do in the, in 40's, a long way short, because AI 5 will be capable of so much, then AI 6 will come shortly after that, and it will be capable of significantly more than AI 5. So, and then, subsequent generations. But there's that, and then there's, then we're still going to need a lot of training compute, and, a fair bit of that should be the actual AI 5 and AI 6 computers so that we can do reinforcement learning on these things. But then there will probably also be quite a bit of other NVIDIA compute or whoever's doing the training compute at that point in time, which it would be hard to imagine Jensen not being the number one in that market at that point in time.
Well, I mean, I think that I think that NVIDIA will certainly occupy the lion's share. I know, is the lion's share technically a majority? I think the way we model NVIDIA is they have like 50% of the market in the out year, as in they lose share because everybody's investing in their own, and still they maintain a hyper reasonable share. But there's no doubt that
an extra hyper reasonable profit share.
Well, that's the question. I mean, it's like as you're losing share in semis, you're typically not able to maintain margin. Like you would think, oh, I'm giving up share because I'm keeping my pricing, but usually it happens where you lose share and you lose margin at the same time. And that's the real thorny question about
providing
NVIDIA.
The services on top, which
sure, yes, you can like be moving into higher margin pieces of the industry, but the fact is, like NVIDIA is already somehow magically occupying like an almost software type margin selling in semis. This does not typically sustain. I think it's really clear, at least to me, that the inference side is going to be much more competitive than the training side. And the challenge is that more
and much larger than the training side.
Yeah, and more of training is actually happening through inference now, like chain of thought. Yep. And basically think of the simulation stuff that Tesla's doing. Yep. They're doing that using their chips, right? Like they're using there's a reason that they have their inference chips in their data center today, and they're talking about going, their inference chips becoming the training chips, at least on the AI 6 timeframe. We'll see if they can get there, but it's partly because, reinforcement learning happens basically by running an inference chip over and over again, not by running a training chip. And so if your kind of like frame on NVIDIA is, well, sure, Amazon and with its Trainium chip, all these guys are investing in their own inference chips because that's an OpEx for them. And so, they still need an R&D engine to like figure out what to do next. But then once it becomes productized, they have inference chips they stick up against it, which are, more economical. They don't have to pay out NVIDIA's gross margin. Kind of, it's like more predictable what the workloads are. And so then therefore they can like concentrate on the, basically ASICize it. But then if those inference chips then become the tool by which you're doing training, then it eats more training share over time. And so I think that NVIDIA's relative positioning in that future is just worse against a market that is growing, astronomically.
Yeah.
Those are I think the way offs there.
It is. There's somewhat of an assumption there built in, though, that the workloads that are happening on inference are static enough across time to where you don't need a relatively general inference platform in order to continue to stay at the frontier of what it's like. If you're going to do an ASIC, especially, but even if you're going to like have TPUs or Inferentia chips, whatever these things are, those are a shot at a moving target of what the inference workload looks like.
Yes,
so
I think that's totally valid. And that's actually, if you look at Tesla's history, the miss with Dojo. Their AI, well, not just Dojo, but their AI 3 chip, I think, was like mis-spec'd to what they actually really needed. As in, they didn't know, and I'm not totally sure how their architecture has evolved from here, but they definitely did not realize that they would need transformer style operations on their chip. And so that was computationally costly to do on AI3. But then that's how they got to like how they were interpreting intersections and stuff. I think they've actually simplified out of that a little bit, but net, I think you're right that it's kind of like you don't know exactly what the architecture is going to look like. We're so early in the engineering space on AI systems, and so it is dangerous to. And I do worry, kind of like they are optimizing the chip to what they think the architecture is right now, and will remain. And maybe that's a valid set of moves, but maybe it then again miscasts them a little bit about what they need. So they continue to need to rely on NVIDIA to do the training side, just because they're actually compressing into a model that they're shifting against the chip that's like not totally optimized to it, but now they have so much headroom, it's fine. And I think you can generalize that where, if I think so. Yes, it's not all dire for NVIDIA. I mean, it's an amazing company. But I do think that like there's hefty competition coming after them. There's no better advertisement for other people to compete with you than a huge gross profit line. And that's what they have. They have amazing gross profit. And so TSMC is like, hey, we should have some of that. And kind of, Amazon and Tesla, all the big NVIDIA buyers are like, why are we spending all this money on their gross profit? This seems dumb, and so everybody's like trying to like pick away at it. And we'll see.
Which I think also underlies the business logic of Jensen supporting companies like OpenAI but especially Oracle and CoreWeave that, buy the whole turnkey solution. They're like, hey, we want to have some customers who, show off the flagship product in its full glory, fully vertically integrated, NVIDIA and nothing. Very, very fascinating space. I think I want to be respectful of your time. Should we go ahead and wrap up here or?
Sure. Let's do one or we probably should actually. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, then we will do that. Fascinating conversation. Thank you for this time with me today, Brett. I'm sure we'll circle back to this and similar conversations again in the future. And don't add us if you are sad that Optimus is not going to be printing billions of dollars in cash in 2028. I'm sorry. That's just not going to happen.
I mean, I think that would be a heavy lift. I would be, for an individual buyer, I think I would be optimistically hopeful that you'll be able to buy one in 2030. But I think actually for an individual, like a household level robot, I think that's where I would
put like an Optimus from Tesla or just robot
an
from
Optimus
someone?
From Tesla. You can buy a spy robot from China right now if you want. I just would suggest that you do so. And or another way to think about it is think about the robot dogs, right? The robot dogs seem like they should be useful, but they're obviously not that useful because only, something like 25,000.
You only see them in YouTube videos.
Yeah. So it's like you look at it and you're like, God, that should be really useful. But nobody can figure out a really broad way to use them. And so I think a bipedal robot that still can't really do anything except walk around, it's just not going to be that useful until it can do additional stuff more than just like pick it. Like the robot dog can like pick up something with its little robot dog head. You know, you need more than just like a clamp. You need something that's like another edge above that. And humanoid robots are always going to be in competition with the special purpose robot that you otherwise have. I don't think there's a universe in which or the universe in which we no longer have dishwashers because you have a humanoid robot to hand wash all the dishes. I think that's a much farther way away. I think that, kind of like the special purpose tools in a lot of cases will be better. And so then that leaves the humanoids have to plug into these kind of like general purpose, more ambiguous, in some ways, really radically harder problems. And so crossing a threshold of doing like a sufficient number of those that it's worth having it wander around my house is challenging. On the other hand, if it would just walk my dog, I'd probably buy it. So, one versus the other.
And for those who think, well, Brett Adcock has one washing dishes in his house. I mean, you just have to think about the billions of dollars that it costs Brett Adcock to have that figure one robot wash his dishes one time.
Yes, it's true. And, like I said, a dog sitter, think about how much people pay to lodge their dogs. Forget owning the robot, just have a robot traveling around to like dog sit, throw the ball to the dog, take it out into the yard, prevent it from getting eaten by a coyote, and, pour some food in a dish. How hard can it be?
Yep. I would definitely pay some money for that. I don't know if it would be enough to afford the robot, but...
Well, no, but you just need to rent the robot. If you're going to lodge your dog with like a dog sitting place in LA, that's like, I don't know, it's like $50. Maybe it's $100 a day. I don't know. It's like a hotel cost for your dog. You'd rather have the dog be at home. You can't have the dog be at home because you don't trust somebody to come in without robbing you. So then you need either a friend. If you don't have friends, you need a robot. The robot comes to you. It rides in a cyber cab. It shows up. It's the dog's best friend. This is the way it's going to work.
Totally.
All right. Thank you, Hans.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. Have a great day, everyone. We will see you later.